Tyler Merritt, thank you so much for joining me on my podcast, man. I am so excited to have you on.
What up? What up? I'm stoked, man. This is going to be good.
All right. So I got to say a couple things just up front. Mostly these days, I'm not doing a ton of interviews on the podcast. I'm mostly just talk. And I love interviewing people. But usually when I interview people, it's people that I already know. And we're friends or we're colleagues or we're client or someone that I have some backstory with. And in this case, so everybody listening, Tyler and I literally just met like 5 minutes ago here on Zoom. But Tyler, man, I feel like I know you. And I'm sure so many people say that to you because of your incredible book, I Take My Coffee Black, that I had the privilege of listening to the audiobook, which I highly recommend everybody do, just a few months ago. And so first of all, man, just thank you for your book and your work. It's had a huge impact on me, on my wife, Michelle. And as someone who's written a few books and knows a bit about what goes into it, just bravo to you, man, because it is a beautiful, powerful, really important book. And I just want to thank you for it. Right.
Listen, I appreciate that. And I'll tell you, it's different when you hear that from somebody who's a writer who understands what going into a book means. And so I want you to know that I don't take that lightly, man. And especially it's almost too like doing comedy. When another comedian says to you, like, that's one of my favorite comedians, or like, you know what I'm saying? Like it feels that way, especially in writing.
Yeah.
So that means a lot, man. It really, really does, especially since this was my first book and I didn't really have the structure of going like, how do I do this right? I really more so just told my editor, I was like, I've been telling stories all my life, and can you just trust me to tell stories in the way that I think is the most effective? And I think we accomplished that, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have so many questions about the book and your work, but I want to tell you the kind of the journey of how I came to the book, because it's kind of funny and it'll give you a little insight into me and we can sort of dive in from there. So sure. I had seen your video Before You Call the Cops a few years back and loved it and was really touched by it and shared it and just thought it was so moving and powerful. And then fast forward to a few months back, you and Jen, your girlfriend Jen, were on Glennon Doyle's We Can Do Hard Things podcast. Yeah. And I listened to that and I was like, oh my gosh, I love this. And my wife and I are big fans of Jen and her work. And we had seen some posts about you, but it was like, then I hear the conversation and I tell Michelle, oh, this guy, Tyler, he's really amazing. I don't make the connection at that point right away. I think you mentioned the video or something, but I'm still sure. But then we find out about the book, and my wife, Michelle, who's the reader in the family, although she's gotten way into audiobooks,
for sure,
she ends up getting your audiobook and she starts listening to it. But the funny thing is, I was actually annoyed. I was annoyed for two reasons. Well, first of all, she mostly listens to novels, but every now and again, she'll take a break and listen to something nonfiction.
Sure.
But I was annoyed because I had mentioned it at first and then she went and did it. But then she was laughing and loving it so much so, Tyler, I actually got jealous. I was like, wait a minute, who's this dude you're listening to? Because my wife also doesn't always put her earbuds in. So she's listening out loud. So I'm hearing your voice and you're telling stories and laughing. And like, here's the deal, man. I talk a lot, right? I speak for a living like you.
Sure.
And my wife and I have been together for 22 years, absolutely adore each other. We have 2 teenage daughters, but dude, my act is pretty stale here at the house, if you can imagine, especially after 2 years of COVID. And like everyone, like the girls will say to me, Dad, you're talking too much. And I'm like, hey girls, Dad actually gets paid to talk. And they're like, yeah, not to us. Right. So with Michelle being so engaged, like I had this weird irrational jealousy that it's like, wait, she's like listening to this other man who's telling stories about his life and I'm jealous. And she was like, are you really jealous? And I was like, yeah, actually I am. I don't really know why.
You're like, because also it's an audiobook, like something that I've done before. And I don't remember you laughing at have you even listened to my audiobooks? Right.
Totally. I was like, yo, babe, you know, I do this too. It's like, you know, that bit that Chappelle talks about taking his son to go see Kevin Hart and everyone's laughing. He's like, I do this too. And that was kind of my little ego. You know, and then she was like, but she kept saying to me, babe, you have to listen to this book. Because my wife, who's white like me, right, who grew up here in Marin County where we live, which is very white. I grew up in Oakland, and she kept saying, he's making all these references to like Black culture that I don't understand, but I'm getting them from the context, but I know you'll totally understand what he's talking about. And I was like, so after a while, I finally am just like, okay, fine, I'm going to listen to the audiobook. And it was this great moment because I started to listen. And of course, I loved it right out of the gate. And then I got to do one of the things that my wife loves the most is when I come to her and say, babe, you know what? I'm sorry, you were right. I totally needed to listen to this book. It's so good. So anyway, I just love all of
I
it
love that.
because like that's how it came about. And like just knowing you through listening to you on Glennon's podcast, we've actually been friends with Glennon for years.
Yeah.
And then the book, it just, to me, there were so many things, Tyler, in your book that I could relate to. And I want to just kind of start as we dive into it. I mean, you talk a lot about in the book and in your work that, you know, how important proximity is. And being close. And I just am curious, like, for you to have the courage to write such a vulnerable, open book and share your story so honestly the way that you did.
Yeah.
A, how was that to do even a year later since it's been out in the world? And B, it felt to me like you were really modeling what you were talking about in that regard.
Sure. I'll tell you, first of all, thanks for all that, man. That means a lot. Really quick, let me say about the audiobook. The two things that I had when I came to my publisher was, first, I said, any publisher that I sign a deal with, you need to know that I'm going to have to be able to cuss as much as I want in my book. And just know that I'm going to cuss as much as I want in my book, but I'm also going to talk about God. So it might be a little weird. So I just need you to be okay with that. And they're like, cool. I was like, also, I have to be able to be the one who narrates my audiobook. And they were like, I think we can do that. Because, you know, some publishers like have people do it, you know, and I said, I have to be the one who does my audiobook because I have a very specific thing that I want to do to make it sound kind of like a radio show, but also like a podcast, but also just like I'm talking to you with an audio, and a very specific idea. And I knew going into it what I wanted to accomplish. And I knew I wanted the listener to know that I was kind of in on the joke by having Jen, my engineer, on it, you know, and being very aware that we were in a studio recording this thing, but then doing things like having my mom come in to where you're going like, is he really calling his mom right? Like, what's happening here, you know? And so all of that to say, I put this thing out there that I had never heard before, hoping that it would land okay.
Yeah.
And people responded really well to it. So that means a lot to me. And since you listen to it, you know, I was genuinely cracking myself up sometimes when I was reading it. Like I was genuinely laughing. Like people were like, oh my gosh, like how you laugh at yourself. And I was like, no, I was genuinely like, you know, and you know, writing books, like it had been a while since I had actually read it.
Yeah.
So I would read a part and be like, that's really funny.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Anyways. So thank you for that.
And everybody who's listening, I mean, I highly recommend the book, and I highly recommend you listen to the audiobook because it's such an experience. And just like Tyler and I are talking right now, like that's what it felt like listening to the book. So I know I said this a few minutes ago, but it's like a long way of me saying, like, I feel like I know you. I feel like we're friends, as presumptuous as that might be, because you shared so much of yourself. And then I listened to you interact with both of your parents, with Jen, your engineer, even with James, your friend, by the way, who my daughter Samantha and I saw in Hamilton back in 2017 and loved, and he had just started in Hamilton. And then of course I'm the Wikipedia guy, and I'm like, oh, this dude was in Aladdin and he won a Tony and he's amazing. And Samantha got a photo with him and he signed her playbill, and it like blew her mind. And then
he's from the Bay Area. He's from Oakland, man.
Right. And I've listened to you guys talk more. And then I'm like, oh, he's an East Bay guy. Like, I love this dude. But so anyway, it just kept being more and more of like, you and I were like separated. But now, what year did you graduate from high school, by the way?
I graduated in 94.
Okay, so I was 92, but so many were close in age. So many of your references were like all this stuff from the 90s. You went to college in Santa Cruz. I was in Palo Alto at Stanford. I'm like, we could have bumped into each other. I feel like this guy and I would have been friends and known each other growing up.
What year did you graduate from Stanford?
96.
Listen, my band played at Stanford in that time period.
Did you?
Now, granted, Stanford's huge, so you probably weren't there, but we played at this like kind of student event-y thing.
Sure.
But that's a whole other
Okay.
This is the problem with getting onto a podcast when you've never met the person before.
Right. We just start doing the whole name game and the backstory.
Right. It's just hours of people meeting each other. So let me answer your question.
Yes.
I'll tell you, I did this release for my kids' book like on Monday of this last week here in Nashville, and somebody asked me about to take my coffee black, and they were like, it's been a year. How do you feel about it? And I said, I'm going to be really honest with you. On September 13th at 11:59 p.m., like the minute before I Take My Coffee Black came out, September 14th last year, I was sitting in the same very chair, starting to regret that I had, like, I genuinely was going like, did I make a mistake? Like, did I make a mistake writing something so wildly transparent? Like, I knew that I wanted to ease you, the listener, the reader, into my story, but by the time we get to the end, kind of give you some information about me that feels so intimate and so close that you can't help but to feel like we have like real actual proximity. Like that it wasn't just, you know, I told you about my mom, my dad, and all this, but I knew that as we got closer to the end of the book, I wanted you to feel like you knew me in some ways, maybe even more so than some of your close friends.
Right.
And though that was my original game plan, though that was my original game plan, I underestimated how that was going to feel when I wrote it.
Right.
Let alone what it was going to feel like when I put it out into the world.
Yeah.
Because it occurred to me when I was writing the book that there gets to a part where you're like, is he the antagonist of this story? Like I don't even know if I like him anymore. You know what I mean? Because I was just so like, you know, there's this guy who ought not be mentioned, who I thought who ought not be mentioned. I'm just not going to talk to anymore. And I'm just letting you know, as a reader, that I just was like, nope.
Yeah.
And I'm messing around with all these girls, and that's just my storyline, but I'm being honest with you about it, and we're getting somewhere. Like, follow me and we'll get there.
Yeah.
And in my mind, when I wrote it, I was like, this is good. This feels like something it's meaty and it feels interesting. But when it was done, it felt like so much, bro. Like, I felt like, I don't know if I want to have this in the world. Yeah. Like, is the gamble worth it? Is the gamble of going, I'm going to talk about proximity, therefore I'm going to give you an example of it.
Right.
And is that gamble worth it? And up until the day it came out, I didn't think so.
Right.
And then it came out and people began to respond to it. And to be really honest with you, my launch for my book didn't go that well. That's a whole nother conversation. And so when it first came out, I was really kind of like, I just, you know, put this book out for 4 people to read it, you know, like, did I just pour my whole soul out, you know?
The only thing worse than being vulnerable in front of millions of people is being vulnerable in front of 5, right?
5, right? Right. And then slowly people started reading it. And like you hope a good book does, exactly what happened with your wife is what has been happening since.
Yeah.
You know, a wife will listen to it and her husband's like, what is going on?
Right.
And she's like, you have to listen to this thing. Or a roommate you know, all these people are kind of doing that thing, and it happened. So the simple answer to your question is, it was hard. Yeah. It was not easy. Even though it was planned, I underestimated how it was going to feel like on me once I did it.
Yeah.
But it ended up in the long run that the returns were worth it.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. You know, as you're talking, I can both relate to my own experience of writing books and, it's like, oh shit, what did I say? And now it's out in the world and I can't take it back.
Forever.
And it's, you know, our friend Brene Brown likes to talk about the vulnerability hangover. And it's like, it's one thing to say that to a person or in a public forum or on a stage somewhere, but it's another thing to put it in writing and put it out into the world. And you know, as you were writing it, I can imagine, and as I was reading it or actually listening to it and thinking about some of these people in your lives who are now sort of characters in this very compelling story.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting to talk about your own real experience and about other people who are still alive. I noticed, like, both of my parents have passed away, and I had a different freedom to write about my parents with them both being gone. And I appreciated the openness that you shared about your relationships with your parents, because it felt like you told the truth about some of the stuff that was hard, but you also did it in a way that's respectful. And it's very clear how much you love both your parents.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, like, how that journey was, not just with them, but with everybody else, even he who should not be named. I know Michael Steele asked you, because I listened to a podcast you did with him right when the book came out, but like, Have you talked to him?
Dude, Michael Steele was one of the first podcasts that I did. And he asked me, like, I thought to myself, no one's going to ask about that. That was the first thing he asked.
Right.
Like, he went on, he was like, welcome to Michael Steele podcast. Let's talk about this guy.
Right.
Right. I was like, bless it. So let me I'll tell you about my parents first.
Yes.
There is a reason why there aren't a whole lot of Black people memoirs. Okay. And the reason why is because Black people ain't trying to let you know about their family like that. Like, yes. It's just like this unspoken rule of like, nah, that's our shit. Yes. You know what I mean? Like, yes, and so I called my mom and dad one day and I said, when I was writing the book, and I was like, hey, I'm writing this book and I'm going to talk about us and growing up and what that was like. And my mom and dad both were like, Tyler, that's really sweet. That's great. But you can't talk about certain stuff, right? And I was like, yes. I wasn't surprised by that. Like, I was like, yes, there are certain things I will not talk about.
Right.
But I did say, Dad, you need to know that I'm going to talk about how when I started doing theater, you just kind of like bounced. And how when we were doing sports, you were like, what up, what up, what up? And then when I started doing theater, you left. And I need you to know that that's going to be told.
Yeah.
And he said, okay. But I also don't think that he knew how much it really affected me either until he listened back to it.
Yeah.
But he also didn't say, no, that wasn't me. Okay, let me take that back. Originally he did. And I'll tell you, the conversation went like this, bro. It went like this. Hey, Dad, I'm going to talk about how when I started doing theater, you completely stopped coming. You never came to see any of my performances. And my dad, this was an honest conversation that I had with my mom and my dad and myself. It went like this. Dad, I'm going to tell people about that. He goes, boy, I went and saw your things. Jerry, what was that one show I went to? And I was like, Dad, first of all, if you are trying to figure out the one thing that you went to,
right,
we need to talk about this, and you don't remember it. Like, let's. Right. I was like, come on, and he kind of laughed and he was like, okay, I'll give you a pass on that.
Yeah.
And then with my mom, I'll be honest with you, man. Even though my mom comes off as like a superhero in the book, and that's like the number one most people say. Like, that's the number one thing most people say. As soon as they tell me about the book, they're like, I want to meet your mom.
Right.
And I'd already talked about her before you called the cops, right? So, there was also a thing for me that I felt it to be very, very important that people knew that a Black man's relationship with her mother is more than just that she's the provider,
right,
or she's just trying to take care of her child, but instead she's also the model, right? Yeah. That she can be the model to that.
Yeah.
And though I got so much of my work ethic from my dad and so much of my kind of hard-headedness from him, like, my mother instilled to me more than just being a mom who was just at home. Like, I got to watch her in business and I got to watch her hustle.
Right.
So that part with my parents was really special. But then with everybody else, man, and because writing books, I had to change some names out of just sheer, like, not to get sued.
Yeah.
But everybody else, it just felt special. And I wrote my book very different than a lot of authors do. Like, I wrote it chapter by chapter. And what I did was I would write a chapter and I had a readers group, and I would send that chapter off to my readers group of like 15 people.
Yeah.
And I would have them read a chapter, report back to me, and then I would start to pull the things that were funny with everybody. Like, if everybody laughed at the same joke, I was like, that's staying in here.
Okay.
Right. Or if everybody went, oh, that story specifically affected me, that's staying in here.
Yeah.
But because I was doing that, as I kept going through the book, I made sure that everybody who was in my life in the book was a part of that reader group.
Gotcha.
I was going, hey, I'm about to write about you and I want you to read this.
I love that.
So it was cool, man. It was cool.
Right. Well, and one of the many things, Tyler, that I found relatable about your book, and this might seem a little strange on its face, how much you shared about your experience with your parents, in your family, going down to the South, growing up in Vegas. and being black. So I'm white. I don't know what it's like to be black. I grew up in Oakland, and so much of my formative experience was actually being around Black people, being around non-white people. And actually, I mean, and this sounds so weird, and I say this sometimes when I'm out in the world, and it doesn't totally make sense, because I get and understand now as a 48-year-old man what white privilege is and how I have it and how it expresses itself and all these things. But I spent so much of my life when I was a kid actually wanting to be Black and thinking that Black people were way more interesting, way more honest, way cooler, way more connected to each other in this way that I actually found there was a level of envy that I had. That being said, like hearing you talk about your experience, I got such an insight into you personally and some of the struggles and some of the goals and ambitions and desire, all the things. But it was listening to you talk. It's like, oh, wow, I could relate to some of that up close, not from the inside, but from a very, very close proximity, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And so I appreciated that in so many ways. And it's funny though, the other part of like you also being really tapped into pop culture and to a lot of things that like white people type music and people wanting to take your Black card and all that stuff. I was laughing because I was like, oh my gosh, it's like the inverse.
Right.
You figured out how to connect with white folks and understand what's going on with white folks and what's cool with white people and all this stuff. And it's like, and I walk around in life not meeting that many white people like me who had that experience, if that makes sense. But in a way, listening to you talk about the multicultural experience you had growing up in Vegas, there were some similarities from what you shared that I really appreciated you talking about so openly.
Yeah, I love that. And I feel like I'm about to stereotype here, but I feel like you can tell when white people grew up around Black kids. Like as an adult now, like if I meet a white dude, I'm like, you have Black friends growing up. Huh? Like I can tell, you know? But there's really this honest, like true feeling about that sometimes, man. It's just like me growing up, I just had so many different people around me.
Yeah.
That, God, I mean, I was into R&B, I was into hip hop, like hardcore rap, all that. I was into that, but I also had so many other flavors of people in my life. Like I told a story about how I came into Bon Jovi because this, girl was like,
right,
do you like Bon Jovi? And I was like, yeah. Let me go listen to them. I'll report back. And I didn't realize that those little moments, man, started shaping my life. You know what I mean? Like, those little encounters started to become pieces of me. And I didn't realize this until later in my 40s when I started to write about it and realized I was so damn lucky.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? And you were too, being in Oakland and in that area. Gosh, did you experience the MC Hammer days?
Oh, are you kidding? MC Hammer and his whole crew used to be around all the time. In fact, so I was a baseball player and basketball player, but MC Hammer sponsored a bunch of teams in what's called Young America, which was Oakland's, Little League. And his crew would show up like 20 deep with all these cars and outfits, and you couldn't even believe it for like a Little League baseball game. And it's like, oh, Hammer and the crew are here. So yeah, are you kidding? That was like, I graduated in 92, Hammer's first big album came out in 89. And we were all, before everyone started hating on him.
Yeah. But you remember Oaktown 357, probably.
Oh, for sure. All of that stuff,
man. So having that's a very specific type of experience that you had as a young white man.
Yes.
That whether you know it or not, and obviously you do, because you're obviously emotionally intelligent, like you now years down the line are able to look back and go, let me say this. I think what could be tricky oftentimes with white men, especially.
Yeah.
And I love that you address this. Like you grew up in an environment where you had a lot of Black people around you. You had Black friends, you were influenced by Black culture, but now that you're older, you're able to say, even though I had these experiences, I'm also recognize my privilege because of the color of my skin.
Yeah. And Tyler, I had so I also was raised single mom. We didn't have a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting hearing you talk about your mother. Like my relationship with my mom was different than if I were Black, I'm sure, but I could relate. And there were so many of my friends whose moms were so important in their lives. And like me, their dads may not have been around necessarily. But I remember a couple things. And, you know, I get to high school and I'm like, so just some context, like I was the only white kid, not only on our basketball team at Skyline High School, I was the only white kid in the entire Oakland Athletic League, all 6 high schools. So when it was intense, and like when they would say white boy, they were talking about me, not just the white boys. It was like the one white boy. And it was an interesting experience that I didn't fully unpack until later, because while I don't know what it's like to be Black, I don't know what it's like to be a person of color, I don't know what it's like to be gay, I don't know what it's like to be anything but me. I do know the visceral experience for a long period of time at a very formative age of what it feels like to be other. And to not be in the majority, and to be made clear to me on a daily basis. That like, you're not like us on this level. But the highest compliment that I could get when I was a teenager from my Black friends was they would say to me, Mike, you know what? You're pretty cool for a white boy.
Yeah.
That was basically saying like, the way I interpreted it, it's like, I feel safe enough with you that we could actually be friends. And I felt like what I also got at times, and I'm sure there were conversations that happened when I wasn't around, it may have been a little different, but I got some insight into the real conversations that were happening. And on the other side of it, at home, I had an older sister, and I also would get to be a fly on the wall to listen to the girls talk about the boys. And so I feel like I got this incredible education that a lot of people don't get.
100%, man.
Of hearing people talk about some of the pain, the frustration, the annoyance, the difficulty of dealing with people who look like me, both because of my race and my gender. And the weird thing is, I was so young and so wanting just to be accepted anyway, I didn't mostly get defensive or take it personally, because I didn't think that I was one of the people they were talking about. Because I was in the conversation. So that proximity piece, I felt like we were brothers, or we were friends, or with my sister and her friends, I knew I was the little brother spying on the conversation, but I felt like I was getting some insight. And I didn't understand that, but listening to your book, it crystallized at an even deeper level for me. Like, oh, that was proximity for me. And a super important education that was invaluable.
That when you're living in it, it doesn't occur to you that that's what's happening. You're just living your life, right? You're just trying to exist in the world that you're in. But then you're able to look back on it and go, man, like, I've now touched all of these different places and people in such a way that when I sit in a group and I begin to hear all these different opinions come in and all these different aspects of how people feel about things, you're able to look back and go, wait, I can hear you differently. Because of the proximity that I've had with you throughout my life.
Totally.
And yeah, go ahead.
Well, and being able to have some of those hard conversations, you know, one other thing that I heard you say this in your interview with Michael Steele that I thought was really interesting. You were talking about in the context of politics, and someone asking you like, how's it to go home for Thanksgiving? And you're like, it's not a problem. Like, I'm Black. Like, we talk about these things. And even to your point earlier, it's like, oh, we don't talk about the family business outside of the family, but we talk about things real and honest. And I do remember really appreciating that and going, wow, there's a different level of conversation about sort of hot button issues. If you like, white people are so afraid to like talk about sensitive stuff, and, oh, we don't talk about religion, or don't talk about politics, or don't talk about racial issues, but I would get around Black people when I was young, and they were just honest and open and like arguing and talking about the issue of the day. And one of my friend's dads said something to me when I was a senior in high school. So I played basketball, but I was a baseball player. That was my thing.
Yeah.
And I had already gotten recruited and committed to go to Stanford. And I ended up getting drafted that year by the Yankees out of high school. I didn't sign, but so I was,
out of high school.
What
position did you play?
I was a pitcher. I was a left-handed pitcher.
Golly.
But and in the Bay Area, I mean, it's hard to get much attention as a high school athlete. But like my baseball teammate and good friend growing up was Jason Kidd. We're the same year, and Jason was like the best basketball player in the world coming out of high school. But one of our friends' dad said to me, he pulled me aside one day and he said, "Listen, Mike, I want you to know a couple things. First of all, we're all really proud of you." Wow. He said, and if you notice sometimes that some of the parents don't seem that excited about your success, I want you to understand this in context. He said, it's not that we're not excited. We know how hard you've worked. We know how passionate you are. We want to see you go play in the major leagues, and we're all going to root for you and cheer for you. He said, but at some deep level, we know you're probably going to make it no matter what, even if baseball doesn't work out. For some of our kids, we're not sure. And so there's this dilemma going on inside of us emotionally. And I'm like 18 years old having this conversation, Tyler, but I actually appreciated the honesty of it. And I could get it. It wasn't personal to me, but I'm like, oh yeah, he was teaching me about white privilege before that was a thing or people were talking about it. But it was like, you're probably going to be okay, Mike, whether you make it to the big leagues or not, which turned out to be true. And a lot of these other kids that I was playing with, it was like, there's a part of us that would rather some of them be having the success you're having, and it's not personal to you.
Well, dude, I'm gonna say something that I've never said out loud on a podcast, but I talked to Jen about a lot. And anybody who's in my life who knows me, that like really, really close, knows me a lot, right? I'm about to put something out on Front Street. I'm letting you know now. I'm about to say something that I'm going to regret that I said on tape. Okay.
Okay. I appreciate it.
I highly, highly, highly share a love-hate relationship with football. Okay.
Okay.
Back in the day, I used to ask myself, how in the world did people used to watch gladiators and cheer them on, knowing that they were cheering on people to their death? Yes. Like, that was a question that I asked for as a young kid. Like, did nobody go, hey guys, like, we're cheering, like something, there might be some ethical issues here, right?
Yeah.
So with that in mind, I get it now, because it has been proven to us that we are killing people in the NFL. Like, people are dying. It is now proof. It's science. So for all of us that are like, believe science, we have now found out that CTE is taking the life of individuals for a sport. With that in mind, I don't know if you know this, and your statistic people will probably figure this out. People that are listening to this, they're statistic people. With that in mind, you know who has stopped playing football? White kids.
Yeah.
Because parents, especially suburban parents, are like, no, it's not worth it. Like, go play soccer or maybe play baseball. But this sport where you're getting hit in the head like a woodpecker every day, it's not worth it. Go do something else.
Yep.
You know who doesn't have that option? These little talented Black kids. And so, sure, proportionally, like, joking wise, you can say there's so many NFL players that are Black because Black people are just good at sports. But also, when you're Pop Warner and you're 7 years old and somebody looks at you and goes, you could ride this into millions of dollars someday.
Yeah.
Sometimes for those kids, the option for something else just isn't there.
It's true.
So you don't have moms that are saying to their little Black kids, like, no, we're not going to put you in Pop Warner, or you're not going to play football in high school. We're pulling you out.
Yeah.
Because it's just too dangerous.
Yeah.
Instead, that may be their only way out. All that to say, it's tying into the conversation you were having about you playing baseball and somebody being so wise at your age then to communicate that same concept to you.
Right.
You know?
Well, and I appreciate you saying the thing about football, because I similarly have some moral dilemmas watching football, rooting for football, with all of that. But to your point, I mean, some of us have different options than others based on a variety of things. You know, another thing related to that, Tyler, I'd love your thoughts on this, because so much of what you share in the book, I mean, even the opening scene that's so poignant and painful and powerful, with you talking about, you know, seeing this older white woman in her truck as you're walking and taking off your hood and sunglasses and trying to make yourself as safe to this woman as possible. And then she has this whole reaction anyway. And, you know, I just really appreciated you saying that and demonstrating and illustrating at a visceral level, like what it's like for you to walk around in your body being you, and the things you have to think about that I don't have to think about. And a lot of other people who don't look like you don't have to think about in the same way.
Sure.
Like, how you did it in such a beautiful way in the book. And how else do you find that you can explain? I personally find myself so frustrated with people that can't understand that as a phenomenon and have awareness and empathy. But I'm just curious, like, how not only have people responded to that, if they've read your book, they get it at that visceral level, but like, how do you deal with that as you sort of walk through the world talking about that with people?
Well, I'm going to let me give another example of how what you just said is just such a real thing. It's a very tangible thing. And I try to make, and what I've done with Tyler Merritt Project is try to make really complicated things simple for people, right? Like because we as writers, we're wordsmiths, right? Like we work with words. I try to take the most complicated thing and try to simplify it. So let me draw this picture. And this is something I've said on podcasts before, but are people gonna be able to watch this as well or no?
Okay. There'll probably be some clips of it, but we're recording it on video. So
yeah. So here we are, Black man, white man, 2 years apart or so, right? You graduate 92, I 94. I drive kind of a fancy car in Nashville. My car is kind of fancy. If you and I, you were in Nashville and you stepped out of my car, how tall are you?
6 feet.
Okay, you're 6 feet. You also at 18 had the opportunity to go play for the Yankees. Yep. Insane. But right now, if you were to step out of my car, I could probably guarantee that most people would assume that you could be a million things. You could be a doctor. You could be a writer. You could be an ex-football player. You could be a ex-baseball player. Like you could be a country music star that people don't know who they are.
Right.
When I step out of my car and it is a white person, 98% of the time, if someone decides they want to talk to me, they go, "Are you a ball player?" Like it's not even it's just an automatic assumption of like, "Do you play football?"
Wow.
Like, "Are you a Titan?"
Really?
And something you might not ever think about, but that's I get out and they're like, did you used to, now granted, look, I'm 6'2", dreadlock, I'm a big dude.
Yep.
But I want to be my words paid for this car.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm a writer and I'm an actor and I create content for social justice issues to connect people because I believe in love more than anything else in the world. And I drive a fancy car because I like how it looks. Like I can't even tell you anything about it, but I like how it looks. But the assumption of you thinking immediately, especially with older white men, and I don't mean that in a mean way, but just, usually older white men come over to me because they want to talk and they're like, "So you play for the Titans?"
Right.
Or, or "Are you a bass player?" And I'm like, I wonder if you were to step out of the car, I'm sure you have assumptions. I'm sure people might assume things, but your options are endless.
Right.
Of what it is you do.
Yeah.
And that's just not really, so I say all that to say that goes along with the same concept of what I talk about in the very first chapter of my book.
Yes.
Right. Like you growing up in Oakland, you surrounding yourself with so many different types of people in your life. Somewhere inside, it's woven into you that Black people could be anything.
Totally. Everything in my world was filled with people of all races, but doing different things and having different roles and being in leadership positions. My mom was the most important person in my life as a woman. All of these friends of mine who I admired and idolized. One of the things I was thinking about this morning, knowing I was going to talk to you, and reading your book had me just go through my own journey as you were taking us through your life in middle school and high school and college and after but when I was at Skyline High School in Oakland, it was predominantly African-American. There were, a good percentage of Asian kids, and then white folks were much more the minority. But in all of the honors and AP classes that I was in, it was almost all white and Asian kids. Yeah. And then a handful of Black kids who had decided, I'm not going to worry about being cool. I'm not going to worry about what people say about me. I'm just going to, right? And I remember admiring that. And then I had one friend, my friend Kwame and I were boys and class president and vice president. Like we had went to middle school, high school together. And Kwame was the star of our football team. He and I both went to Stanford on sports scholarships. Kwame got no grief from anybody anywhere. And he was in all the honors and AP classes, and he was still cool, and everyone liked him and everybody respected him because he was the man. But I remember thinking it's because Kwame is buff and on the football team and no one's going to mess with him. So everybody kind of looked out for him. Like the dudes that everyone was scared of sort of had his back, and then everyone in the honors and AP classes, like, but I watched him walk through that. And I remember just having so much appreciation and thinking to myself, what he's doing is actually way harder than what I'm doing, because no one's giving me any shit for being a good student. It's like, dude, you're white, you're supposed to be a good student. Or if you don't want to be a good student, that's fine. But it didn't seem like people cared either way.
Right.
But I was like, the pressure and the expectation in the box is so much smaller and more specific. And I just remember feeling both grateful and also sad about that back then.
But the fact that you're so aware speaks to what I mean when I talk about proximity, where you're learning a life lesson in real time, in real life, and getting experience it. And it's versus something that I have to try to tell you about now as an adult, to be like, imagine if you will, Mike, or like a lot what I do in my book. And I kind of talk about that in my book too, where I talk about how I was a rapper in junior high, and though I had all these gangs, I talk about how rap music saved my life. Like I learned to rap because there is this weird, like honoring, like if you have a specific kind of talent that is out of the norm, that are, and culturally Black people, we're just like, oh no, that's my dude right there. Like, that dude can flow. Like, have you heard what he can do? And so it kind of gives you this protection, because it's exactly what you said, like your boy Kwame, like, especially Black people around, they look around like, that's our dude. And he could represent us if he makes it out, or we get behind him because what he does is special. But it's different than just like being another cool, talented white dude at a school. No, if you sense and feel that, especially as a young man with Black folks, man, I can't explain it, bro. I can't explain it.
Well, and one of the things I've noticed, Tyler, more recently, so an interesting thing about my work. So I've been doing my work for the last 22 years, and mostly what I do is in the corporate world. Like I go in, I get invited to speak to teams and leaders, and for years, I've been talking about all kinds of stuff, teamwork and authenticity and vulnerability, and a lot of the things that like you talk about in your book. One of the things, though, that I had shied away from until about 5 or 6 years ago was like, I didn't hardly ever talk about race or gender or orientation or anything related to now what everyone refers to in the corporate world is, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right. All of which was, I got my degree at Stanford in American Studies with a specialization in race and ethnicity. I was like living and breathing this as a kid growing up. But as soon as I got out into the professional world, two things occurred to me. Number one, I was a young, straight white dude. Like, who wants to listen to me talk about race and gender and orientation? Like, all of the white people are going to go, what are you talking about? And all of the people of color and women and gay folks are going to be like, shut up. What do you know? Like, you don't need to mansplain to me about this. And I was like, okay, I'm going to, out of respect and deference, not do that. And then as the world has evolved the way it's evolved, especially more recently, I'm like, oh, we need more white people talking about race. We need more men talking about gender. We need more straight people talking about gay people, and what, not from a place of like, let me tell you how it is, but just from a like, so my most recent book is called We're All in This Together. And one of the things, though, that I've grappled with for most of my life that I still struggle with to this day is the like, I believe in my core, and this is so of the many reasons I loved your book, that it's like, we're way more alike than we are different under 100%. The surface. And at the same time, I'm constantly humbled by the degrees to which we're different and how that shapes our experience. That's so different. Like, I have no idea. My wife will say something to me, and I've known Michelle for 22 years, and she'll say something about what it's like to be a woman, and it'll blow my mind and go, oh my God, I never even thought about that. Sure. Because I don't have to. Right. And so I just like, I struggle with that paradox and that tension, because I don't want to be one of these, well, I don't see color and we're all the same, and like, right. And at the same time, like, how do we navigate that?
Well, I want to say this, and I think this is really, really important. One, and I don't, this isn't like, I'm not reinventing the wheel by saying this. White people's silence is stronger than anything. Like, a silence, like when we notice when you don't speak on something that should be spoken on. Like we're very aware of that.
Yes.
Now, tone and how you go about it also makes a very big difference. And I think that's where it can get really complicated,
right.
and where oftentimes it makes white people not want to say anything because they're afraid to say it wrong.
Right.
You follow me?
Yeah, for sure.
So, especially with white men, and hear me, you have to understand that I mean this respectfully, and I know you know this, yes, but I feel like there might be people that might be listening that might be white men that are like, I don't know, but I can tell that you know this. There is a piece about like mansplaining that white men do in a way that is like that's their shit. like yes. I will sit sometimes and watch a white dude mansplain something and be like, you could get a PhD in this. Right? Like,
you should talk to my wife and my daughters. They know a bit about
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so when it comes to race, oftentimes it has everything to do with tone and how you present yourself when you're speaking on the issue. But just know that silence sometimes is even a stronger recognition of us feeling like you're just not there, right? Yeah. But like us talking over the past minute and you being like, this is how I grew up. This is what was like. One of my middle school friends' name was Kwame. Like, you know what I mean? I'm like, all right, Mike, no, this is my dude. Like, I can tell, you know, it gives you some validity when you go, I want to speak about this experience. And then you talking about what you studied in Stanford, like the mixture of your history of how you grew up, what you studied in Stanford. I'm just saying, like, it gives you a little bit more validity, at least to be able to come to the table and go, let me give you some thoughts on this. And let me be clear in saying, I'm not saying I know everything, but here's my opinion on this based on some experience in which I've lived. Right. Yeah. And that can mean so much. Yeah. But again, it all has to do with tone and how you go about it. And Jen and I talk about this all the time, man. And man, we talk about this all the time.
Yeah.
Because I run into this all the time.
Yeah.
And it has to do with, brace yourself, it has to do with white women. So being in social justice and oftentimes being on the internet as well. Yes. You might give your opinion about, as a black man, I will speak to something. I'll give you a very specific example.
Yes.
When the slap happened with Chris Rock and Will Smith. Okay. Yeah. I posted something about it. And actually I was with Jen. We were in Louisville, Kentucky at the time. Okay. And the slap happened. And the way I was affected by the slap was very different than Jen.
Yeah.
She saw it on me. She saw a weight that happened. And I was like, oh my gosh. And she was like, what's going on, man? What's going on? And we were like in this bar and I walked over to these black dudes who were like over in the corner and I saw them watched on the phone. Like, I felt like I needed to talk to some other black people. I'm like, yep. Bro, let's talk about this. And what was happening for me is I said, this is going to open up a door.
Yep.
For white people to begin to have conversations about things that they think they know about. And it's, and I said this like in real talk, like it happened. Yeah. And this was 2 minutes later. And I was trying to explain to Jen, I was saying like, listen to me. White people are going to start to speak on this as if they know what's happening here. And then that's going to be the conversation for the next couple of days. This isn't going to be about whatever misfunctions going on between these two black men and his wife. Like, this is about to become, you know, and it was not even 5 minutes later where someone who's really, really influential, who's a white woman, went on social media and said something about it. Yep. And then Jen was like, how do you feel about this? And I was like, this person just gave a green light for every white woman to now give her opinion on this thing that is between these two black men. And she was like, you know, maybe you should turn I wrote about it later, and people lost their shit.
Yes.
But mostly white women lost their shit on my account. And I finally was like, I'm going to turn off comments here. When I tell you, man, when I tell you, Mike, when I tell you the shit I took from white women coming at me, not a single black woman, not a single black woman,
yes,
but white women who came to me and said, why are you trying to silence my voice? Why are you trying to silence me? Why are you trying to silence me? And I'm like, silence you on this thing that happened between two grown-ass black men in public, which it should have never, ever, ever happened. And now you feel like I have to hear what you have to say? Like you're not going to be able to go to sleep tonight unless I hear what you as a white woman has to say to me right now? Like the posture that you are taking of feeling like the input that you have to give to me is so wildly important.
Yes.
Is asinine to me.
Yeah.
And the whole reason I bring that up, Mike, is it has to do with, I so badly want to have my white brothers and sisters in the fight for social justice and for equality.
Yes.
But there's a posture that needs to be taken the same way that I, as a black man, am forced to have to understand what my posture is in this world. I'm forced to. I don't have the privilege to just walk into a building and be like, let me just say what the fuck ever I want to say.
Yep.
I understand how posture works in conversations that have meaning.
Yes.
And so for as badly as I want for, and I need there to not be silence, I long for the posture to be correct. Yeah. And listen, I can't tell you what that is. I can't like submit a paper and go, this is what this posture should look like.
Yeah.
But I think that's why proximity is so important.
Yeah. Well, and I really appreciate you sharing all of that because I think it's so poignant, real, relevant, and again, for everybody listening, just in context, right? Jen, your girlfriend, who's amazing, Jen Hatmaker, is this incredible blogger, author, activist, human being who you obviously know and are in love with, and
who's white, just in case if people don't know who she is,
walking around in the world in the relationship that you're in. Like, not only do you have to walk around and think about this as a black man in your life in general, but you're also in love with a white woman, and so the dynamics that play out in that are your real life on a daily basis. My wife, who's white, and I, while we think about and talk about things that have to do with race and gender and orientation, all of these things on a daily basis in our family with our two white daughters and the four of us living in a predominantly white area, although the girls go to a public school that has a pretty high number of Latino students, which we very much appreciate. So it's like the whole world isn't just white folks.
Right.
That said, though, again, the things that we're forced to, it's interesting you bring up the Chris Rock, Will Smith thing, because I was actually I had just finished reading Will Smith's book. And I love Will Smith, to my core. I feel like Will Smith and I, we're all around the same age, kind of grew up together. I've watched his entire career. I love him. I also love Chris Rock. And watching that happen for me, I had so many different reactions and emotions. Right. And I remember, it's funny, I remember saying to Michelle, right when it happened, this is going to be received very differently by different people. And that in of itself is going to create a whole other thing about this, because I had all these mixed feelings, and I was texting with my buddy who I grew up with, who's also white, but his reaction and mine on the text chain were very different than the sort of what you're supposed to say as a liberal white person within a few minutes or a few hours afterwards. Right. And then I just realized sometimes I feel like we get indoctrinated into these certain ways of thinking, group thinking, and the challenge is, how do we get out of that? I grew up in a very politically progressive part of the country, right? In Oakland, in Berkeley, but I remember saying as a kid, like, you have to agree with the whole thing from top to bottom, or else you're kicked out of the group. And I remember early on feeling like that doesn't feel right. Right. That doesn't seem right. And I think it's part of what you're speaking to. And what I love that you talk about in your book, and I love, Tyler, about who you are in the world, is like, you also straddle these different worlds in like being involved in the church and being involved in the performing arts and being involved in activism and being in a relationship with a white woman and living in Nashville and growing up in Vegas and like all these things. Like, you're a walking, beautiful, I think, sort of paradox of stereotypes in a lot of ways. But I'm just curious, like, how you reckon with some of those things. You know, an example being whatever I can sort of assume some of maybe what you posted and what the reaction was to the Chris Rock, Will Smith thing, but like, how do you navigate that yourself in your life and in your work?
Well, so let me talk. It's funny because we were acting like the Chris Rock thing happened like last week, which
Right.
it did not.
No.
But what I basically said in this comment, and I'm going to say this to tie into your answer, what I said into the commentary was, I basically said, hey, let this just be family business.
Yes.
I was like, as much as you may want to, because they made a major mistake of doing this in public.
Yes.
Therefore, making it for public consumption. You have to understand that, and I said this in the post, I said, what you have to understand is there are very few Black families that get together and don't have what you saw on stage happen in their homes in closed doors.
Yeah.
And then we continue on as family. Mm-hmm. We work it out. Maybe Uncle Cliff and Scotty don't get along as well as they used to, but that's family business. Right. Like, it's not like Will and Chris didn't know who they were.
Yeah.
Like, we now are part of something that we probably shouldn't be a part of.
Yes.
And it's okay to just go, that's y'all's stuff.
Yep.
Go and handle it. And in my post, I basically said, white friends, I just need you to understand culturally, what you witness is no different than what happens inside of a home.
Yeah.
And just let them have this. That's all I said.
Right.
And the let them have this was the part that my white women friends were like, you're not going to silence our voice on violence. And I'm like, right. I'm not trying to silence your voice on violence. Right. I'm not trying to tell you can't talk, but the specifics of how you're delving into these people's lives, man, like just let them go.
Yeah.
So because of how I've grown up, because of the people I've surrounded myself with, I could have just went through and just started like Xing everybody out. I've been like, if I have one more person who jumps in my DMs and cusses me out because they feel like they're not being heard or whatever. Right. But instead, I tried to look at every scenario and every person that came to me, and I'm just using this whole situation example as a person.
Yeah.
Right. I was going, I don't know what your story is. I don't know what your background is. I don't know if you come from a place of abuse where when you saw that, it triggered something inside of you that's so much deeper. Like, I don't know if I don't know what your story is, but what I am going to do is I'm going to try to respect your story. Therefore, when I hear your opinion or when you come out with me from how you feel about something, I'm able to take that in context to who you are.
Yes.
Which ties into how I feel about life in general, which is that we all have to do a better job of just seeing each other.
Yes.
Of seeing people.
Yes.
Of saying to ourselves, I need to actually pay attention to what it is you're doing and what you are about before I decide to determine what it is you're about and who you are.
Yes.
And if we're able to do that, for better or worse, Mike, like, it's possible I might, and it's happened. I've spent time with somebody and 2 minutes in, I'm like, oh, you're a little racisty. Okay. Like you're a little racisty. But now that I recognize that and I see it, let's see if I can't maybe lean in a little bit more and figure out maybe where you grew up, how it is, like why you feel this way.
Yeah.
Or if you just have a dark heart.
Right.
Which is different.
Well, and as you're talking about this, and I know we're getting close to being out of time, but it's like, I feel like I heard Brene Brown on Mark Maron's podcast years ago, and they were talking about the left-right divide in America. And they said something, I think Mark said it, but it really resonated with me. And I feel like it fits to what we're talking about. Mark said he feels like the mantra on the political right in America these days is never apologize. Mm-hmm. And the mantra on the political left is never forgive.
Wow.
And it's like, it's an oversimplification, but I feel like that gets perpetuated. And sometimes in these discussions about really important, really emotionally charged topics, we get into this way where it's like, we're not willing to give people grace and space. Right. And there's that fine line between, I'm not going to apologize for or condone someone's violent behavior or racist behavior or whatever. And at the same time, all of us have racist tendencies. All of us do shit we regret. All of us say things and take actions that we want to take back. And it's like, how do we navigate that as human beings? Like, I can have boundaries and say, I'm not going to engage with that person or those people because of how they've treated me or people that I know or whatever. But at the same time, like, is it possible to forgive, to reconcile, to get deeper than some of that? Because I feel like that's, Tyler, what your work and what the Tyler Merritt Project is all about, from what I understand.
Yeah.
But I'd love for you to speak to that a little bit more specifically before we wrap up.
Sure. There's definitely this and also thing, you use the word grace. And I feel like oftentimes we use the word grace so much having to do in spiritual circles, probably more than anywhere else. Right. But the reason why I found it to be so important in my book, man, and I'm glad that you brought this up because this is a really important point. One of the reasons why I didn't just draw this super pretty picture of who I am in my book, because men, we do this a lot. There are a lot of male authors, especially quote unquote Christian authors, which I don't consider myself a Christian author, but who there's a lot of books out there on like how-tos and like how to be better and how do we do this, but rarely are there books about like, I'm kind of jacked up. Really, I'm really jacked up.
Yes.
Right. But the reason why I found it so important to express that in my book, to show my mistakes, to show my missteps, was for the reader to understand that it's those missteps that allow me to understand grace so strongly. In going, how can I even begin to not forgive you with all of the jacked upness that I am?
Right.
I like, you know what I'm saying? Like, how can I not give you a pass for some of your things that you do that are ignorant or that are just wrong? And in the same sentence, show you and tell you all of the things that I've done that are ignorant or wrong, but I'm okay now. Like I get in chapter 18 of my book, I basically kind of give a, which is the last chapter, I basically give a plea and going, hey, I've now told you who I am. I've let you know that I'm not perfect, but I also want to let you know that if you have grace for me, then I'll have grace for you.
Yeah.
And that feeling is the thing that kind of propels me through the entirety of my life. Jen and I joke a lot about how like in her community, she's like, I don't negotiate with terrorists. Like if someone comes onto her page in her community and is like, says something crazy, she's like, yeah, we usually just handle this, or my community will handle it on some level. And I've gotten in trouble many a times for taking the time out of my crazy busy day to talk to Susie about why she probably shouldn't have said what she said, or maybe a different way to go about it.
Yeah, you and me both, man. That
and let me be clear, I don't do that all the time.
Yes.
But if I find an opportunity to kind of bring people together, and if I think there's some ability for us to grow, then I try to lean into that, which is kind of what I try to do in the entirety of my life, because I just believe that people are just so damn beautiful.
Yeah.
And that we can get along.
Yeah.
And though there are so many of our stories are similar, we are also wildly different. And that's what makes us so great. And I talk about this, especially when I talk face-to-face or on speaking gigs. And I tell people in the audience, like, listen, you have to understand that your story, your very specific story that only you have, that's the kind of shit that's going to change my life.
Yeah.
Like the more I know the intricacies of who you are, the better my life is going to become because of it.
Yeah.
And that's what I hope. That's what I hope we can feel.
Yeah. Well, and gosh, as you're talking and as I was reading your book, I just kept thinking of one of my favorite mantras is, the more personal, the more universal. And I feel like that's what you were just saying. And that's so true. And gosh, Tyler, I mean, there's so many other things that I could ask and would love to talk about, and we could go on and on. You and I obviously have a lot we can
I knew
share,
this was not going to be short, by the way, because we've never talked to each other. Like,
right.
Well,
and thank you for coming on. I mean, again, like I said to you, I just wanted to hit record and just kind of get to know each other in this context, as weird as it is, but I feel like I know you from reading your book, and I just really appreciate the book and what you're doing. And we didn't even get a chance to talk about your beautiful new children's book, A Door Made for Me, that just came out this week. By the time this episode drops, it will have been last week. But just before we end, like, how are you feeling about that? It's such a beautiful book and a beautiful message and a beautiful story, but I'm going to
do what I did with I'm going to do with you what I do with Michael Steele. And this, because Michael Steele was the first, one of the first podcasts that I had post my book coming out, I think.
Yes.
But he had read it and he had seen it. So have you had a chance to read A Door Made for Me?
Yes, I have.
Okay. How do you feel about
it?
Now, to give clarity, it's a picture book. So if anybody's listening now, it's literally a picture book, like for ages 3 to 5 to 8 or whatever. So
and it's a story that's pulled, you share the story in, I Take My Coffee Black, but I just felt a sense of love and sadness at the same time. Like I felt love for this little boy and compassion for him, and I felt sadness for his friend and for what happened and for the experience of having that happen, and so grateful that you shared it the way that you did. And what a beautiful lesson. My girls are 14 and 16 now, and I was feeling a little bit of sadness that, like, I would have loved to have read this to them when they were 5 and 7, when they used to let me read them bedtime stories like this. Now I get a lot of eye rolls with stuff like that. But
look, Dad, leave.
But we will, like we do a lot, we will leave the book around the house, and maybe they'll pick it up and read it themselves. So
I love that. I'll tell you really quickly, with A Door Made for Me, I wanted to create a kid's book that gave real, actual speaking points for decisions to be made kind of in real time, right?
Yeah.
So there's the moment, and if you're listening to this podcast, it's fine. I'm not going to like ruin the book for you. I mean, it's you get it or you won't.
Right.
It's 30 pages, right? Like, making the decision for Jack to go in the house and leave Tyler on the sidewalk, which was different than the actual story that I tell in the book.
Right.
Gives the opportunity for the parent or for the child who's reading to go, is that what I would have done?
Right.
Like, would I have gone inside?
Yeah.
And if I wouldn't have, why wouldn't I have gone inside?
Right.
Or for a kid to ask, which has already started happening. The book's only been out 3 days, but I'm getting messages like crazy for kids to ask, like, "Mommy, why did he do that?"
Right.
Or why did this woman want to say, but that Negro boy that black boy needs to stay outside?
Right.
Like, and then a parent's kind of understanding the intricacies of the idea of Black people being treated like pets sometimes. And like, you can't come into my, all of that. And then the other part of the book that I feel just is like special and probably a little bit different than most kids' book is it didn't wrap up with a really pretty bow. Right?
I actually loved that. I was like, it didn't all work out in the end. It's actually like real life.
Right. Like, Jack came back to play and I was like, I missed him, but I also was hurt. Yeah. And I said, no, I didn't want to play with him anymore.
Yeah.
And my grandpa saying to me, like, it's okay, man.
Yeah.
It's okay to feel that way. Yeah. But don't give up on him.
Right.
And being able to give that piece in a kid's book, man, to really be able to have parents be able to talk about that stuff. And I read it for the first time in public on Monday of last week. And I don't think I realized how impactful it really was until I was able to read it in real life. So thanks for your words that you said about it. Cause I just haven't had a lot of people, I haven't got a chance to talk to a lot of people face to face about it. But I think it's pretty special, man.
Well, it is, man. And I mean, I Take My Coffee Black has had a huge impact on me and Michelle. A Door Made for Me is such a beautiful gift to so many. And I just, Tyler, since I read or listened to I Take My Coffee Black, I've been following you on social and looking at the things that you post and the videos and the content that you put out there and the way that you engage with people. And I just want to say, as we wrap this up, like, not only do I really appreciate the work that you do, I also appreciate the intentionality behind it and the way that you interact with and engage with people in such an earnest and authentic and beautiful way. Like it's not an act, and it's obvious that it's who you are and how you roll. And I admire it. I appreciate it. I feel like the world needs more of it. And I just appreciate getting to connect with you this way. So thank you for coming on and chatting with me and everybody here who's watching, listening.
I appreciate that so much, man. And I'll say I really do. That means a lot. And I'll say with I Take My Coffee Black, I feel like it's just getting started, man. People I think are just now really starting to get it in their hands and really starting to listen to it and really starting to talk about it. So the hope is this time next year we can talk about how so many more people have kind of experienced. And we need to do this again. I feel like we haven't even really touched the surface.
We got more to talk about. So I would love to have you back. And I'm excited that we got to connect. And I look forward to the next time.
Yes, man. Appreciate you, man.
Thank you. All right, my friend. Do you have just a minute or two here? I know we've gone long, but I just hit stop.